that Middlebury, downtown Middlebury, has had many iterations over the years. It's not what it was 20 years ago, or 40 years ago, or 50 years ago. And in 5 years, it's not going to be what it is now. It's constantly a work in progress. It's constantly transforming. So we're creating a bridge with our stories for the Middlebury downtown that we remember in days of yore, that we experience today, and that will be created in the not too distant future. I want to point out the committee members who brought this all about. It was just a small little grassroots group of people, and if you have any questions, you can speak to Lynn Rowell, who's in the back, Dorothea Langevin, Barbara Doyle Wilch, Mark Wilch, Dick Thodel, and Cliff Adams, who isn't here today. So we were the planning committee for this. We want to thank our partners who inspired us and have helped us set this up. Our biggest partner was Bundle, and you heard from Kelly, who's been a really great help. We've also partnered with the Ilsley Library. Renee is here sitting in the back if you have any questions, but the library has been a great resource of the history of Middlebury, as has the Sheldon Museum. And we also want to acknowledge MCTV, which is taping this, and some inspirational help from the Vermont Folklife Center. So housekeeping, Kelly talked about the bathrooms across the street. There's also water on the counter. There's no food in this space, but if you get thirsty, do hydrate. Now on with the stories. As I mentioned, MCTV is taping all of this. So there are a couple of important things about that. All the storytellers are going to come up and use this mic, and it's important that you hold the mic close to your mouth because that's the audio for the taping of the stories. And also we want to make sure that everybody here can hear every word that you say. It's really important for the taping that the space be quiet. That's why we've turned the air conditioning off. So it's important all your cell phones are turned off and any other beeping devices, and that there not be side conversations or other noise going on in the space, so we can get a good, clean recording of this event. We have two hosts today for this first cycle, David Munford and Joe Shine, who probably most of you already know. And I'm going to turn the mic over to them in a minute. There are going to be 3 tiers to the storytelling. All the stories are going to be roughly 3 to 5 minutes. First tier is a group of storytellers who have committed before today to tell stories. They will be the first storytellers. Now, some of you are sitting in the audience and might think, whoa, I just thought of a story I want to tell. And you'll be in the second tier. All we need is your name. So you may have a card that Barbara or Mark gave you, or if you don't, just raise your hand and somebody will give you a card, write your name on the card, and then we will very quietly pass it to the hosts. And they will call on you for the second tier of storytellers. And then we hope there will be time at the very end for spontaneous stories, where somebody will just say, whoa, I just thought of a story I want to tell. And all the storytellers will come up here, use this mic so it can be recorded both visually and auditorially. Any questions before we get started? Let the show begin. David and Joe.
Want to introduce yourself, Joe?
So I'm Joe Shine, and my family moved here in 1985. And I just wanted to say that back in the day, for me, meant going down to Ben Franklin's in 1986 or so and buying penny candies. And so I imagine that for all of us who've had an experience of Middlebury, what back in the day means is different, and each perspective is valid, and we want to hear it.
I've had the distinction, I guess, of having lived in the same house more or less continuously on South Street ever since 1954. So 41, and we've kept it very much in the spirit of my parents, who had a very, very open door policy. You just never knew who was going to show up, but they were all treated the same. A lot of them stayed for dinner, and so we got to meet quite a few people. But I would say that my education around here, a lot of it goes back to some friends bought a farm in 1957 out on Munger Street, and it was an old rundown place. And they were going to, they needed a fire pond, for one thing. And they got to be friends with an old fellow who was a very well-known outdoorsman, trapper, and generally a wise individual, and his name was Russ Dwyer. So the first time I saw Russ Dwyer, they were excavating the fire pond, and I went out, and here's this old guy down on his hands and knees, down in the bottom of the excavation, in front of the bulldozer, and I said, what in the world is he doing? And they said, well, that's Russell Dwyer, and he's rescuing frogs. So I thought, well, that's interesting. So Russell was well known to be the seventh son of a seventh son, but it was not considered to be polite to mention it. It was just, that was not a subject for conversation. But as with many old Vermonters, he had a sort of a cut-to-the-chase style. So one spring, it had been a particularly rough winter, so somebody went out to see Russell, and they said, well, Russ, how was your winter? And he looked at him and he said, well, I read that Bible from cover to cover twice, and I don't believe a word of it. So, I would like to introduce an old buddy of mine. We've known each other for many, many, many years, and we're still pretty much neighbors. And Hudson Tilford.
Hey, I'm going to sit down and do this. My goal is to take kind of a walk. My goal is to kind of give you a walking tour of downtown as I remember. It may not be 100% accurate due to some excesses of the 60s and 70s, but I will do the best I can. Starting at the top of the hill by the monument is the Town Hall Theater. When I was a kid, it was, well, the Town Hall Theater, but with a radically different orientation. They had a town meeting one day a year, and then it was a movie theater for the rest of it. I remember very bad equipment and snapping films while the college boys gave them heck for things breaking. I wasn't there for this, but I'm told one of my brother's friends from the balcony made retching noises while he poured soup on his friends down below. It then became the Belmont Restaurant, and after that, the Knights of Columbus, and went back to being the Town Hall Theater. Moving down the street was the Park Diner that had various and different owners over the years, and when I was a teenager, it was a good place to stop in for a Coke. I remember my friend Tommy Rule had his feet out in the way, and this gentleman told him to move his feet, and Tom gave him a bleep you, and do you think you own the place? And the fellow pointed out that as a matter of fact he did. And that did not go well for Tom. Walking over the soon-to-be replaced railroad bridge was Giro's Plumbing and Heating, the Abrams Clothing Store, Lockwood's Restaurant, and I vaguely remember the First National Store on the corner, but Ski House was there for many years. Johnny Kenworthy, who, as I was told, was gassed during World War I, was the boiler technician who slept in the basement of the building. And as Theron Wolcott described it in an article I read, twice a year they would tackle him, remove his coveralls, hit him with the fire hose and the scrub brush and put a new set of coveralls on him. And he is credited with the comment as he was standing on the corner, and somebody said, "Boy, there's a lot of strange people in Middlebury," and he smiled reassuringly and said, "Don't you worry none, they all go home after Labor Day." Walking across the park, you came to the Lazarus store, run by Stan. Lazarus is a true prince of a guy, and he was a Democrat long before it was trendy to be a Democrat in Vermont. And moving down the street was Mike Lazarus United 5 and 10 store, the junk store. I had the honor of being the best man at a wedding next to the thread counter. For $15, Mike performed the ceremony and gave him a plastic wrapped copy of his words of wisdom. And then at the National Bank, it was run by Phil Hinks for many years, and Phil Hinks gave me a ride from Bristol to Middlebury one day, and of course he knew all my family, and I answered all of his questions, and he was very interested in my father's fledgling earthworm business. And my father went in to see him to get a loan not too long after that, all prepared to explain the business to him, and Phil said, "You don't have to tell me, I gave Hudson a ride." The Vermont bookstore is still at the site it's always been at, but it had a drugstore on each side of it, the Park Drugstore and the Rexall. And then there was Calvi's. I wasn't big on Calvi's, but my brother-in-law from Boston loved going there, getting a cup of coffee and a stale donut and reading the paper. And every time when he walked in, Mary Calvi would ask him, "Who are you?" And the answer, "I'm Arch Tilford's son-in-law," always got him an okay. Across the bridge was Farrell's The Gray Shop and Ruby Rogers' toy store. Later, it was the Rosebud Cafe, which was made locally famous by a combination of cops and cookies. I don't know how many of you remember the "Welcome to Middlebury, but please don't feed the cops" bumper sticker after a couple of the finest were inadvertently treated to pop brownies. And on the other side of the street was the Midway Hobby Shop and the VFW underneath it, and the bakery was run by Steve Baker. And the next block held the Ben Franklin, which generations and generations, as Joseph pointed out, given $1 or $2 or whatever was real money, and at the age of the kid, just loved to go there. I don't recall who was in the block where 4th and Goal was. IGA grocery store, okay. And behind it was the Star Mill.
And just right next to it was Gold's Photo Studio.
Okay. Behind it was the Star Mill, owned by the Chief of Police, Don Williamson. The bowling alley was downstairs, the pool room was upstairs. I misspent many hours trying to master 9-ball, and I never did. And later, the Alibi was in the building. I was hoping John Reynolds would be here because he could tell dandy St. Patrick's Day stories of putting the casket on the bar for Finnegan's Wake, and anybody who wanted to sit in it and have a drink could do that. And we'd close the lid on John and haul it out at closing time. Store 2 was on Park Street, and if you needed a nice gift, that was the place to find it. The Benjamin block, which now has Two Brothers downstairs, held Egan's Drugstore on the left and the Benjamin Cleaners on the right. And upstairs, Ed Center and Bud Lundrigan would cut your hair upstairs. And That's pretty much my memory of downtown. I don't warranty 100% accuracy, but I hit it with my best.
Chair here.
It's going to be hard to follow that, Hudson. I can remember a couple things though that you didn't put in there because Joe DeGray and Leon Otis had a barbershop across the street from the IGA store in those days, and which was right next to the theater. And Hodbury was down under where the Rosebud Cafe was later on. But the main thing I can think of that you didn't add there was Don Williamson. Actually, my father was the last mill master at the Star Mill before they closed it down and made it into a pool hall and a bowling alley and whatever else they added to it, which later on become the alibi. But one thing you didn't add was Don Williamson was the police chief here in town, but the whole story of Don Williamson is really fascinating. He was actually born in this town many, many years ago. I think around 1900 or 1905, in that vicinity anyway. And Don was always in trouble when he was a kid. He was one problem or another. The police was always bringing him home. So finally the police decided they had to put him to work in the town. And so he was worked for the water department for quite a few years. And then one day they needed somebody to control traffic and they didn't have anybody, so they asked Don to do it. And eventually he was the only cop left in town because everybody else had retired. So he became the police chief. But the interesting point about it was the fact that he was never allowed to carry a weapon. And I got this from the horse's mouth art the other day. He was a convicted felon back when he was a teenager. So he was never allowed to carry a weapon after that. And Johnny Kenworthy's story that you told was really great. I love that story. But I remember Johnny as a boy when I was about 5 or 6 years old. He used to take a string. He had a ball of twine. He used to wrap it around the trees up in the park in the Triangle Green and up the hill. And we used to get up to the top of the hill and get a running start and come down and break his string, and he'd chase us across town. But chased us all home. And it was really pretty interesting story. But Johnny, when he passed away, and I think it was 1957 or 1958, Don Williamson researched his belongings down in the bottom of the Battelle block, and also his cabin he had up on top of Chipman Hill. And they found many thousands of dollars that he had stashed. And it all ended up being turned over to the town. Because you were right, they used to twice a year take his clothes out, throw them away, give him a shower and a shave. Joe DeGray was usually the one that gave him the shave and a bit haircut. But the story was that the way that Johnny made all of his money was he used to sit on the corner by the First National store in those days, and he could see the First National store, the IGA store, Grain Union store, and the A&P store. And if anybody had to have any groceries delivered at home, they would beckon him, and he'd come down with his little cart, and they put the groceries in the cart, and he would deliver them wherever it was. And the way he got the string is back in those days, he used to pack all the meat in paper and tie it up with string in all the stores. And so he would save that string when he'd go to the houses to deliver their groceries. He'd ask them for the string, so all the ladies would give him the string. Now I can remember in the latter part of 1940, I think it was 1944, they took that ball of string and they took it down to the recycling center in Rutland and sold it. And it was like 4 feet in diameter. They took pictures of it, I remember that. It was a huge ball of string. And they used it for recycling, for making stuff for the military in 1944. That's about all I can add to what you said. A couple things that came on later in here was I used to work across the street in what was called a Midway shop, as you called it. But I worked in the TV part downstairs for many years. And actually, I think I was down there about 6 years all total. And I eventually left that job and went up to Burlington for a couple of years, and I came back and we opened up a store up by what was the Grand Union store later on. But anyway, that's about all I got to add to your stories.
Love it. Let me get my cheaters here.
I'll go ahead and call on Gary Baker.
I don't think.
Gary's not here, he'll be here tomorrow.
Oh, but Bud.
I'm filling in for Gary.
Oh, thank you, Bud.
Good.
Thank you, thank you. Come on up.
I'm not quite as tall. So I'm looking around and I'm trying to see how old everybody is. I was going to start talking about the telephone building up on the corner by the drugstore and the hardware store up here on Court Street. Anyone not know the story of that area, of that? Well,
I'm going to interrupt just for a moment, Bud. Can you take a couple steps back, and I think we'll have less feedback.
okay, there we go. Anyway, today we flip out our cell phones and talk to everybody. When I was a kid, that building was full of telephone operators. And it's kind of interesting that that's how far we've come. And the building, who knows what it's full of now? It's some computers, I'm sure. Anyway, I'm Bud Smith. I was born in Bridport, so I don't have a right to some of the memories. But I do remember a few things that Hudson missed, and one of them is that there was a guy named Sam Emilo, who was one of my favorite people as I was growing up. He was quite a lot older than I am, but he taught me a lot about small business. Sam, for a time, had a barber shop right across the street, up the street, probably where the insurance agency was for a while. But I remember that a haircut cost 60 cents when I first went there. It's gone up a little since then. Across the street from that was the Middlebury restaurant, which was an Italian restaurant and a bar. And that was owned by a guy named Jimmy Fusilli. And that was pretty popular among the drinking crowd. Right down below here, there was a place called Rogers and Wells. Charlie Rogers owned it. William Rogers, I think, was. Anybody remember? Was that his father? Maybe, yeah. And but what I remember, which is very little, my dad was a carpenter, and he used to go in there and get windows made. So if he was building a house, Charlie would actually construct the windows right from zero, and he would also build doors. And that was originally powered by the waterfalls. And when I went in there, the only rule that Charlie had, he had one sign there, and it was no smoking. It was full of sawdust and small pieces of wood and everything, and it was a real fire trap. But he didn't have a fire while he owned it. It also had an interesting set of gears, and some of them are still there. And someone also probably knows more than I do about these gears. But along the top of the first floor, where the studio is now, the art studio, there was a what was it? It was a drive shaft that they fed power off from down to each individual machine through some leather belts, and they would have a clutch on this darn thing with these big bull wheels. And when they wanted to run the jointer, they would pull the clutch down and they would draw the power off on that drive wheel. So that was someone must have more knowledge than I do about that. But I've never forgotten that one. Goodrow Lumber Company in East Middlebury has been in business since around the Second World War, I'm guessing. A guy named Harry Goodrow owned it when I was a kid, and he had a mill that was out by the river behind Goodrow's now, and in those days a load of logs would come in, they would saw them up into whatever they needed them for, and that was what you built your house from. So not as many imported things. Cartmel Sales and Service was in the entire marble works, or just about all of the marble works. They had the Farmall tractor distributorship and all the haying equipment and everything, and and some great mechanics. Anybody remember the Phillips brothers and some of those people? They were interesting. Dirt roads. I was born on a back road in Bridport, and in the spring, you really had a hard time getting to Middlebury. So we would have to go to Virginia's to go shopping quite often because we couldn't get up the ledges. What we call the ledges, about a mile out or 2 miles out on Route 125. That was a mud hole all the time I was growing up. Chipman Hill. Anybody remember Chipman Hill? Who's my age? Chipman Hill was open for car traffic up to the top from what's known as High Street. The kids used to go up there parking, and I wouldn't tell all the stories because I'd embarrass Hudson. I know. Church keys. Everybody's too old here. I thought there would be a few kids in, but everybody knows what a church key is. Yeah, all right. So I don't have to tell you that.
Yes, I don't.
You don't?
But you don't have to take the time to educate me right now.
A church key is a bottle opener. And in those days, that was the only way you could open a can of beer or Coca-Cola. Okay. In the beginning of all this, an hour or so ago, somebody talked about the whole idea of today being to get businesses interested in downtown and coming to downtown. And it struck me, I've had a few small businesses around Middlebury, and you know, it's all about, if you want a small business, you find a need and you fill it. And really that's a pretty, everything else just goes along with that. There are many things the younger generation is going to come along with that it's all about finding a need and filling it. Back in those days, the 1960s, there was only one store selling as a convenience market, and that was Sam's Market. Now that was owned by Sam Emelo at the time. Doria's Market, some people remember it as Doria's Market, but Sam's Market was a little convenience market down where Schaefer's is today. The filling stations were just filling stations. You couldn't grab anything other than a spare tire there. So I was about 27 years old, and I already had discovered alcohol, and I used to stop at Sam's Market and pick up a beer now and then, and there was always a line at at the checkout counter. So at the same time, where the Verizon store is now, there was a vacancy. A fellow named Floyd Peck, who owned Peck Glass, owned that store. He had moved down to his new shop. And I went down and talked him into letting me open a convenience market. I had almost no money, and I had no experience, and I was 27 years old and I knew everything. So, I thought I did. Floyd co-signed a note with me at the National Bank of Middlebury with Bob Duclaw. Bob didn't even ask, this is embarrassing to admit, but Bob, I said, where do I sign? And Bob said, well, we don't really need your signature. We've got Floyd Peck's. So that's how much credit I had in those days. So there was a need for another convenience market. So what I'm hoping is someone will find a need and fill the need and fill these stores. And I have nothing else to say.
Anne, is this a good moment for you to tell your story? Do you mind? Okay, great. This is Anne LaFiandra.
And like Joe, I got here in 1973 from away. But I did raise my 3 children here. I met my husband here. But anyway, I just wanted to quickly reminisce a little bit. When I came to town, I'd been living in Europe for 4 years, and I didn't own a car. I got here with 2 suitcases, and I wanted to get to know the area, because I grew up in a small town like Weybridge in Connecticut, and I said, wow, I want to get to know this place. I was walking everywhere, or I joined the ambulance, and I could ride around in the ambulance. And several interesting aspects of that. One was the only training was first aid. We didn't have, well, we started to have EMTs. We didn't have any of the fancy IV or the, defib or any of that stuff. We used hearses, either retired hearses or in-use hearses when not otherwise in use hearses. Mostly for transport to Burlington. And and we would get a call, and the pagers were the size of, small phone books, and we would be told, they live in the Sealy district. And we go, oh, okay, what street is that? It was very interesting, unless you had somebody like Bud Smith or David Mumford who knew the Seelys and the ancestors of the Seelys and the children of the Seelys, where the heck the Sealy district was. But I'll tell you, it was a fabulous way to get to know this community. Feeling a little useful, feeling a lot, not knowing a whole lot about what I was doing. But it made me feel useful, and it made me feel as if I were really getting a sense of this place. So it meant a lot to do. That was 1974. I started the fall of 73, and I was working at the college, and they let you have time off if you got a call back in the day. And I did it until I was 4 months pregnant with my first child. And I realized I really couldn't do it anymore. That was December of 1980. So anyway, it was a very important aspect of me getting to know this community.
Thank you very much, Anne. So I've chosen a couple people to speak. Would you like to?
Sure. Well, I thought I'd throw in just a little piece of incidental history, that there is a connection between the tin ceiling, the library, the war memorial, and the fairgrounds, and that is Colonel Silas Ilsley, who made his fortune in tin. So there's a little bit of trivia for you.
So, Kristen, would you like to tell your story now? Great. Come on up, and I think it's best if you stand almost touching this.
Yeah, 'cause I need to look at this too.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Kristen Hirsch, and I grew up in Middlebury on Weybridge Street, which was the best street in town, I think. All the kids and all the fun and all the spying we did on people and kick the can and all the wonderful things that and friends that we made together. And let me get my glasses on. I have sort of. On Saturday, we would go to the movies. They had little serial series going on, and we'd go to the movies, and that was one of our favorite things to do on a Saturday. If we weren't on a bus with Chet Brush going up to the Snow Bowl, or on another bus with Chet Brush in the summer.
Kristen, would you hold the mic just a little closer?
Okay.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
Okay, that was good.
Sorry.
Okay. There was a skating rink in back of the elementary school, and we used to use that a lot in the winter. The elementary school down on College Street, not the new one. One of my favorite places to go was Eddy Farm, and I spent a lot of time at Eddy Farm. In fact, Doris Eddy was one of my favorite people in Middlebury. She was wonderful. I had a horse there, and I had friends that we went in the 100-mile trail ride in Woodstock one summer. That was 40 miles in one day, 40 miles the second day, and 20 miles the third day. And we finished the ride. Our horses were tired, but we worked all summer. And thank God for dirt roads then, because we could take the horses out and condition them on a dirt road. We can't use paved roads with, it would kill the horses' legs and feet. So, and in Woodstock, I don't know what they do now, but I know the roads were dirt roads in Woodstock that they used. That was 100 miles of dirt road that we rode on in Woodstock, which is amazing.
Sorry to remind you again, but you have to hold the mic uncomfortably close to yourself.
Okay. I worked at Egan's Drug Store, and every Thursday, I worked faithfully all through my years working at the Addison Independent. When they rolled the presses off, and the presses broke, and we would be there until 10, 11 o'clock at night getting the papers together. But it was good. He used to pay us like 50 cents an hour. So if the hours went on, we loved it. But we would come home, Dale Knott and I, we would come home, and we would be covered with grease, with print, dark print, all over our hands, all over our clothes, and we would walk home on Weybridge Street, Dale and I would together. Also, so I found something interesting the other day. If some of you people know something about Jessica Swift, she wrote me a letter, and it was dated, let me see, it was dated February 16th, 1951. And I'll just read you a little bit of the letter. It was, Dear Kristen and dear children, thank you for a darling letter and for all the care you have taken all these years. I was 9 years old when she said this, to keep our community house a happy place. As is always who, when I lived here and played with my canaries and green parrots and the white cat that lay on top of Polly's cage. And it was also, I am coming to visit you when this has been a short, busy visit with love and thanks. Your appreciated friend, Jessica Swift. Isn't that amazing, though? I mean, it's just amazing. I found this in an old box, and just the other day, and I was so happy when I did find it. I can't think of anything else, really, that was the movies. Don Williamson. Yes, Don Williamson. He was wonderful. He was the best guy in the world. We used to hang around by the cannon and everything at night. He'd tell us, he'd come out, okay, kids, time to go home. We would go. We would get on our bikes and off we'd go. And his wife, Ellen Williamson, she let us bowl down at the bowling alley. And she would let us, if we would set pins for her when she had customers. But if she didn't have customers, we could put our legs up in the back and those little duck pins, they'd swim down the alley with we had to set the pins after they came down. But she was really also a wonderful woman, very, very nice. And Don was always very, very good to us. He was the nicest cop you could ever imagine. And I didn't know that he didn't have a gun. We all thought he had a gun. And so I think that's it.
Thank you very much, Kristen. Thank you.
So again, by way of tying certain things together, you mentioned Bernie Egan, and he had a drugstore, and as was previously mentioned, there was a barber shop next door, Ed Center and Bud Lundrigan. And they were great, and I always used to go in there, and they had the most amazing supply of comic books, especially Little Lulu, for some reason. I seem to remember sitting there reading Little Lulu, waiting for my hair to get cut. And usually in one of the chairs, not getting his hair cut, and semi-conscious at best, was Bernie Egan. He would just go in there and sleep. And the reason I mention that is because my dear old friend Arthur Healy, who had a turn of phrase, and he always said, Bernie Egan always resembled an unmade bed.
So I'm wondering if this is a good moment for Alice Perrine to come up. Would just going to move this chair for her. Sorry. Okay, great. Thank you. Would you like this seat? Front and center? Here we go. Okay. And here's the microphone. You can point it towards yourself. That will help.
Okay.
And hold it fairly close.
I'll try to use my teacher's voice. I have a sort of a mixed bag of memories of Middlebury's downtown. They started when I was in college. I was in the class of 47, so in order to go downtown, we had to go with a friend. We weren't supposed to go down alone. And we would go down in the pitch black of night, but we could get to the Old Smith Diner. And our favorite person was Francis, who ran the diner, and he had been a former wrestler. So we were pretty impressed with that. I remember the Gray Shop when we moved back here in 52. And so I have a whole other assortment of memories. But one more memory from my college days, I don't know whether I should give this one or not, but I met my husband at the diner, and we were getting acquainted, and I looked over at the jukebox. They used to have those little jukeboxes and individual tables, and carefully impressed in the jukebox were roaches that were there for life. So I wasn't too impressed with that, but I have fond memories because that was tied in with the same time I met my husband. And after we were married and came back to Middlebury, I think I remember mostly the places that the children went, and I'm sure Ken could give a lot better memory of that. Places like the hobby shop and, of course, if any big event was going up, we went down to the Gray Shop. And the wonderful thing about the Gray Shop was that you could pay $5 a week or a month or however you wanted to pay for your outfit. And so, many of us who were cutting it close enjoyed going to the Gray Shop. I also remember the Town Hall Theater, which you already heard about, the films breaking down, and we all loved to go see Flash Gordon and all the old, it was a wonderful place. But my memories of Middlebury all sort of run together because then later on, when I was teaching, I have other memories of the town, but the wonderful thing about it was that the kids could walk downtown, you didn't worry about them. They all hung out at the Ben Franklin, which you were saying, and I don't know if you remember Ruby's shop. That was another place they loved to go. And the thing I think that I most remember about downtown was Mike Lazarus' store. You went into Mike Lazarus' store and you asked for some weird object that you were sure he didn't have, but he would go rummage around the back of the shop. Pretty soon he'd come forth with it. It might look a little shop-worn, but he had it. There wasn't anything he didn't have in that store. And I also remember the Waits Funeral Home, because we lived on South Main Street when we first came here, and Waits Funeral Home was just 2 houses down, and the kids used to wonder what went on in that back room. And the interesting thing was, of course, that the furniture store was on top and all the undertaking business was below. And once in a while, his limousine was used as an ambulance, other times as a hearse. So when people found themselves, they would always look and see what color the curtains were. Just so anyway, it was a wonderful town, and I hate to see what's happening, but I hope that you'll be successful and get the town thriving. I think given time, we'll come back, but it's going to be a rough few years, I guess. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Can I help you? I got it. Great.
So I just have to, speaking of theaters, back when the Marquee Theater was the campus theater, and there were a few things that we could always sort of rely upon in the terms of its unreliability, if you know what I mean. And one of them was when there was a particularly loud movie going on, we were all looking up at the ceiling, wonder if this was the time when it was going to come down on our heads. It was pretty bad. And then I learned later that one of the reasons that we were not told at the time, that sometimes the third reel went first, and sometimes, you had to be pretty creative to figure out what was going on. And it turned out later that the guy running the projector usually had a girl and a case of beer up there, so it's amazing that we saw anything at all. And I remember once we were sitting there, and there was some cowboy Indian movie, and I think they were burning some guy at the stake, and I thought, boy, this is really realistic, and the film was melting. Oh, yeah. Oh, it's just awful.
Rick Cole, would you like to tell a story?
Well, I've been in Middlebury a couple of years. Just a couple of places Hudson forgot were there, I think. But across the road where the travel agency was actually my grandfather's flower shop in the 50s, early 50s, before he moved to South Pleasant Street. And then next to it was Otis Barber Shop at one time, and then Hod Murray moved there from underneath the other place. Bud remembers. Right, Bud? Couple of places I'd like to see a picture of, actually, sometime, and I got to see if Bud remembers. Maybe Hudson does. Remember the Creamy Stand up by Town Hall Theater?
Absolutely.
And you know what? I find very few people that can remember that. I would love to see a picture of that. And also, Cannon Park, pre-1939, there was a fire station there. I have got a picture that shows a little bit of it. I cannot find a picture of that also. If somebody ever runs into one, let me know. Would love to find it. Couple of other places, Van Ralt, down in the Marble Works. As my dad used to work down there, and like he used to tell people, said they'd ask him, "What do you do?" And he said, "Well," he says, "I'm in women's underwear." Because that's what they made. So that was always his little joke, you know. But there was years and years and years in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, you'd read an obituary of a lady, an older lady, and more than likely she had worked at Van Ralt. They hired a lot of women there over the years. So that was kind of interesting. Parizzo's store, he had a little grocery store over next to Lazarus Five and Dime on the upper side. It might have been before him, but I know he was in there. Okay, so it was Baldwin's store, okay. And, yeah, and then Parizzo bought it, yes. Yeah, so I think that pretty much, Tabor's Paint Store on Merchants Row. That was in there, and then I believe Mrs. Prime mentioned the furniture store, used to be Wade's Furniture Store on Main Street in the Battelle block. And I have seen pictures of that Battelle block. When that block was built, on the Main Street side, it's a little bit less than half of that was not there, was not original. They added on to it a few years later. So that was kind of an interesting thing I've seen there. I guess that's pretty much fill in the pieces, you know?
Thank you. Thank you. Ken, oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Just to add one thing to it.
You'll have to come up here, sorry.
Just to add one thing to that presentation, Rick, was the whole Main Street was one floor lower. And if you go down in the bottoms of any of these stores today, you can see where all the storefronts used to be. And the whole thing was raised at the time they built the stone bridge.
Thank you.
So once again, acknowledgments to Hudson. Didn't mean to interrupt you. No.
And would you introduce yourself? And,
yes.
and,
Okay.
and if you,
I'm Reggie Spooner's wife, and I graduated from Middlebury College in 1950. And Alice was the Supreme Court Justice of Middlebury College. And we used to have lectures in the chapel on Wednesdays. And Alice gave a talk that I've never forgotten. It was about not pigeonholing people. And don't put people in this place and keep them there, but think of them as, you know, not a certain way. And that was your talk. And I was sitting in the chapel. My last name was Carlton, and I was in the front row because they went alphabetically. And I remember that talk, and she was amazing. We all looked up to her.
Thank you very much.
So again, I may be, I'll have to, and correct me, Hudson, if I'm wrong, because I'm pretty sure you were the one who told me this story, but there was a man who was a pillar of the community for many years, John Reynolds' father, Seeley Reynolds, and in 1949, I believe, there was actually a bridge out at the 3 Mile Bridge, and the story went, and it caught fire mysteriously one night, I think in 1949. And the story always went around that Seeley Reynolds had a farm on one side of the creek and hay fields on the other. And he couldn't get his hay wagons through the bridge. So his idea was, allegedly, that by setting fire to the bridge, they would have to replace it with a bigger bridge and he'd be, you know, his problems would be solved. Well, as we all know, there's still nothing there. So I think it was Hudson who told me this, that when Seeley was on his deathbed, I think out at the Porter, and somebody said to him, maybe it wasn't you, that's all right. Okay. Well, that's sort of what the story's all about, who didn't do what. But anyway, somebody said to Seeley, all right, Seeley, you know, we know this is it. You know, it's curtains. You might as well confess that you burned the 3 Mile Bridge. And Seeley looked at him and he said, I didn't, and I know who did. And I'm not telling. We still don't know who burned the 3 Mile Bridge.
That's the answer you always gave my father.
Yeah, oh, that was it. It must have been Arch that told me that.
I'd heard the other part of it. The other part of it that I had heard was that he made the statement, perhaps around one of his hired men, that I wish somebody'd burn that bridge down, and somebody took him seriously. I don't warranty that as factual.
Ken for Ryan, it's a good time for you.
Thank you, Joe.
Sure.
I just have an anecdote, but before I get to there, I was reminded about the campus cinema, and it's all about personalities. And the personality I associated with campus cinema was Frank Lapshire, who was a worker there. And he was a tall, gaunt, scarecrow kind of guy, and us little kids were all very scared of him. And what made it worse was he would hay out on South Street Extension, and he'd walk by our house with this big scythe over his back, and he looked like the Grim Reaper incarnate. So that was my memory of campus cinema, among many. But my anecdote really has to do about living in a small town and the joys of living in a small town. And when I was in 6th grade, I was on the safety patrol, and I had to sub for Kim Potter, who had the crosswalk at the Middlebury Inn. And so it was a rather slow day for students coming across, so I was kind of biding my time and tossing stones into the road and watching them bounce down the hill. And wouldn't you know, but a car came along, which was a little more rare those days, and my stone hit the car, and the car stopped. Now, can you imagine a car stopping right there today? No way, but he did. The guy stopped, he got out, he was angry, and he asked me what my name was, where I lived, and I was pretty nervous. I was really surprised I didn't wet my pants, but I was pretty close to that. And so he got my name, rank, and serial number and read me the riot act and went on his way. Well, that was a Friday, and the next day I was out collecting for my paper route. And one of my customers was Moose Provencha at the Esso station where Otter Creek Bakery is now. And so I go in to get to collect my week's pay, and I walk in and there's the guy talking to Moose along with a bunch of others, because that was a popular place for people to socialize. And the guy he immediately recognized me, and he looks at Moose and says, "Who's that kid?" And Moose looked over and says, "Oh, that's Kenny Prine. He's a good kid." And that was the end of that. So the joys of being in a small town is you don't get away with anything, but there are people who have your back. So.
Thank you.
So, of course, in the interests of tying anecdotes together, Frank had a younger sister, and her name was Rita, and she had a boyfriend, and his name was Jake. And the town is now nowhere near as rich in characters as it used to be, but Jake and Rita were quite a fixture in an interesting, picturesque sort of way. And Jake was usually about 6 paces behind Rita, and Rita usually had some things to say to Jake. So frequently you would see them going, walking out here on Main Street, and and Rita would turn around and just say something, and every mother with every child for 100 yards would be like this. And I'll censor myself, but it was some 4th of July or something, and there are all these people and tourists and everything, and right out here somewhere, Rita turns around and goes, "Get quick, go get down on your knees and kiss my." Okay, right. So at any rate, Kim Potter's brother Chris had an apartment over across the creek from Mr. Upp's, and there was this little kind of tiny little house down in there where Jake and Rita lived. And according to my mother, believe it or not, Rita kept that place absolutely neat as a pin. It was completely clean. It was just the opposite of what you might expect. But Chris had somebody, some girl over for dinner, and things were going pretty well, but all of a sudden, right from Rita's establishment, bursts Rita naked as a jaybird. I don't even want to think about it. And she's yelling, "He's got a shoot! He's got a gun!" And the girl said to Chris, "What do we do? Do we call the cops?" And Chris said, "Not till we hear shots." Yeah.
Ernie, do you want to tell a story now?
I've been around Middlebury since 1939, and I moved there from Munger Street, moved about 3 miles. And when we got to our place there, and I'm right on Painter Road, and all there was is a little barn there, probably 25 feet wide and 100 feet long, and 2 families moved in there. And we put rosin paper up on the ceiling, and we stayed there 1.5 years, 10 of us. And we just had a wood cook stove, and so that's where I've been. But pertaining to Rogers and Wells, if you had to have something made, I had to have a window made one time for a job I was doing. And somebody had warned me, don't go in there and tell them you need it tomorrow because you won't get it. So I went in there and I told him, anytime, Mr. Wells, you get around to this window, you can make it for me. And he called me the next morning and said it's ready to go. somebody else went in there and had to have a glass put in or something and said, I need it tomorrow. Probably in 2 weeks they would get it. So, and let's see, from there, let's see, one that talked about the old telephone girls. They were used to be on Merchants Row, next to where the restaurant is right now. And that's when they moved up to the new building. And then I remember one darn place that I hated was the veterans place was above the Ben Franklin's up there. And that was the draft board, and they called me back in, I think that was 53. I'd been drafted, and being right-handed, I would have let them cut my right arm or my left arm off, but never been into town. And if we ever went to Burlington, I never went to Burlington until I got in my teens. That was going into another country. So I've been carpentering around Middlebury for over 50 years, and I've probably built or remodeled or helped build or something like that, probably close to 100 houses here in Middlebury. And I worked for Dutton Smith a good number of years. And right now we get calls back from a place that we built. I called it a sculpture in Hardwick, Vermont, and I still get calls on it. And it was an ungodly place. And so other than that, I've been around Middlebury quite a while. And old Tommy Burns. He lived right on the corner of Happy Valley Road and Helpin Road. And he worked for the marble factory on Quarry Road. And he told me one time a story that he used to have to get at the job a half hour before everybody else to get the old truck started. And they kept the oil on top of the stove. So he'd put the oil in the old truck and get it going, and it would run all day, whether they had a delivery or not. And at night, he had to take it out and put it back on the stove again. So one day they did have a big block of marble they had to bring to Middlebury, the railroad station down the quarry down there. And it was a chain drive truck. And the steers are hard. He had a young fellow inside of him to help him steer it. Hard rubber on it all the way around. And they started coming down by Middlebury Inn. And one of the chains come off. Man, he said, if you don't think dust didn't fly and things like that, he said, we never made the corner. We went right down across the park. And ended up where the post office there now. And he said, it finally come to a stop. And he said, I think I left it there because I had to go home and change my clothes. So, I see some other things. I've worked for Albert Fletcher. There's a lot of stories on him at Sheldon Museum. He had a little farm on Helpin Road right there, and worked for him for years when I was a young fella. And other than that, I don't know. I've had a lot of stories that somebody could talk about. But.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, one of my mentors as a childhood, I've mentioned him. His name is Arthur Healy, and he was Arthur was a lot of things. He was an architect. He designed those wonderful Doric column entrance to the gym. That was New Deal money back in the 30s, and he couldn't. His take on it was he didn't make enough money as an architect, so he had to turn to painting. And he was a very good painter, and but he was mostly famous for he was about the least snobbish person that I've ever met in my life. He just didn't see it that way. And he would say, people would say, well, professor, and he'd say, don't call me professor. That's what they call the piano player in a house of prostitution. So, okay. And he despised what he called culture vultures. So he was invited to some banquet, and he said, well, may I bring a fellow painter? And they said, certainly. And he brought one of the college house painters, and they were they were in a very expansive mood, and it all turned out rather, I don't know the rest of it, but Arthur came one day and he said, would you like to go fishing with me? I said, well, sure, that'd be great. So he showed up, and he was one of the world's worst drivers. Eventually so he would let me drive, thank God. He'd have an automatic shift car, and we'd be going 60 in first gear, like, oh my God. Anyway, so we went on this elaborate, we had rods and worms, and wow, just spent the day going around visiting all sorts of interesting people, never saw a drop of water. I went through a six-pack, but then, okay, fine. So we came back, and he let me out, and he was still in the driveway. I was headed back to the house, and beep, beep, and I went, okay, so I went over, and he said, about the fishing. This will be good. He said, you don't want to rush into these things. Oh, dear.
Roger Barkin. There you go.
I didn't really know what I was getting into when I signed on, but I'm a real newbie compared to everybody else. I actually only lived in Middlebury for 2 years. I was with the National Health Service Corps from the U.S. Public Health Service, and I came to Vermont to operate Tooth Hollow, which some of you may have heard of up in Bristol, to take care of the underserved. But my first wife was a professor, and she was teaching at Middlebury. She got a position at Middlebury College. So we did live on South Street, and that wasn't close enough, almost wasn't close enough to the hospital, because our daughter was born 20 minutes after we got there, which may be a record for Portner, I don't know, but that was a pretty exciting experience. And is it? Well, we barely made it in. She went into her last contraction when we got up into the reception area of the old hospital. She sat on the bench, and I moved the car real quickly. I got back in, and she was already in the delivery room. So it was pretty wild. And then she was ready to go home after they checked out the baby, made sure she was healthy. And they said, well, no, we can't let you go because the doctor's going back to his office. He'll be back at 5 o'clock. But we were home by 5 o'clock that night. Everything worked out well. And that was one of our first initiations. And unfortunately, shortly after I got there, and I had no responsibility on this, the building where the dental clinic was burned down. And so I called my regional director, and I said, well, what do I do? He said, just stay there. I said, but you're paying me. And they said, that's fine. So there's your government money being spent. But we did try feverishly to find another location, and I will credit Harvey Green with his willingness to rent the space in his office on Wednesday nights and Saturdays so we could keep the program going. And so I did have a lot of free time. And in that free time, I'm probably speaking to the choir here, but I went to the library, and there's a huge collection of old photographs of Middlebury. And I just spent a ton of time in there, just studying the old photographs and going, okay, that's what's there now, and this is what's over here. And so obviously I was becoming madly in love with my life and with Middlebury. It's a phenomenal city, or town. And I have to reinforce the story about, I thought his name was Gene Lazarus. He never corrected me, I always called him Gene. No, that was his first name. Well, he still never corrected me. But I heard the stories of try to go in there and fool him. I tried several times, and just like a mouse, he would go up the stairs, you'd hear him rumbling around on the second floor. I tried to come up with the most absurd things, and he'd bring it right down. And I started bringing people. I said, watch, you're not going to believe this. He never failed. He never failed. I sent my father-in-law once, and he came back out and he said, I used to sell Jergens lotion in the 1950s, and there's a bottle in there that was from the 1950s, and he would sell it to me for whatever the price was on that bottle, 5 cents, 10 cents. Right next to it was another bottle of Jergens that was contemporary, and that was like $3. That one was $3, the old one was 50 cents or 5 cents or whatever it was, that was the most unique experience, I think, in commercial sales I've ever seen in my life. The man was an absolute jewel. He was a treasure. And Probably the two last experiences were pretty funny. I'm not sure how I'm going to finish the punchline of the last one because I think I have to censor it. But you probably all remember the Bakery Lane Soup Bowl. Well, we love that place, and we went down there often. And so I got to kind of know Marge and Joan, and Marge was no nonsense person. She was a very dry, witty person. And my wife was a little bit, my first wife, was a little bit strange in the way she would order things and the way she approached questions and things. And they started out, the whole menu was just 2 soups. That's it. You didn't like either of the soups, you weren't eating there. And then they transitioned into, in the summers, 1 soup and 1 salad. That was it. You didn't like either of those, you're out. So we're in there, and my wife asks her, my first wife, asks her, what is the soup today? And she's, whatever it was, she said, okay, and what is the salad? And she said, okay. And she said, so what are you going to have? And she said, geez, I'm not really sure. And it's one or the other, pick one. So finally she says, okay, I'll have the soup. So I said, all right, I'll have the salad. And so, and Joan was the waitress, and Marge was the cook, the chef. So my wife, my first wife, happened to be. We won't get too far into that. She went off to the bathroom, which was our way of getting served. And that tradition seems to carry on. If we're not getting served someplace, I go, I'm going to the bathroom, I'm hungry. And of course, by the time I get back, the food has arrived. So anyway, Joan comes back, and she says, all right, which one of you had the SHTY soup? Oh, I'm sorry, I blew this, I blew it. My wife said, how's the soup? And I'm looking at her, and she said, what is she going to say? This is her restaurant. What is she going to say? It's awful? So when she came back, she said, okay, which one of you had the SHTY soup? And that was Marge. Ironically, when my career was over with the Public Health Service and there was really no opportunities for me here to open my own practice, it was quite packed with dentists for some strange reason. In 1970, several dentists just decided Middlebury was the place to go. And so there were no openings for me. So I went to Arizona, and I'm opening up the newspaper one day. Marge and Joan had closed down the restaurant, and there's a big full-page article about restaurants in out-of-the-way places around Arizona. Boom, they were in Jerome, Arizona. So we went up and visited them, and then on a later trip up, they closed the restaurant and they opened up a card shop and a novelty shop with everything cat themes up on the main street. So when I saw that, I went in, and there's a rack of cards, because I'm playing on Joan's reputation, from personal experience as well. And she was in the back milling around. I said, look, I'm going to take these cards and I'm going to change them all around and move them all around and move away and kind of go on somewhere else. And then we watched, and Joan comes up to this rack. God damn crazy customers, screws everything up. She never changed. She never changed. She was a memorable character. And to close out my crazy, funny experiences in Middlebury with Mrs. Calvi. I wasn't here, but it was classic. Again, I'm living in Arizona. My friends are going to go visit New England. I said, you have to go to Middlebury, and you have to get an ice cream at Calvi's. So they did, and they came back, and they told me, she said, wow, she was everything you said. I said, well, why? What? She's at her cash register by the front door, and my one friend is walking up with her ice cream. She starts to lick it off the cone, and the ice cream just goes thump onto the floor. Mrs. Calvi looks over, and she says, gee, that's a shame. You ought to get another one. It'll cost you. So that kind of closes out my experiences in Middlebury, but I will say that it is 2 of the best years of my life, and people say I don't look my age, but believe me, I've been around for a while. And one of the things I love to do, and I bought another place, unfortunately, up in Ripton. I felt I couldn't afford a second home in Middlebury. So I bought in Ripton, but I come back every year since 1989. This is my 30th anniversary. I spend as much time as I can here. I've made many friends that I don't want to give up. I just had to lose one a couple of months ago. He led a lifestyle that wasn't ideal. I tried to move him away from that, but he wanted to do what he wanted to do, and he didn't harm anybody. Owner of one of the longest in operation stores in Middlebury at this time, and he was a very good person, and I'll forever miss him.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Just one minor fill-in here about Mike's Five and Dime. That Dick Thodall and I have a mutual friend. I'm sure a lot of you know him, Roger Desitels. And Roger's a wonderful fella, but he's pretty rough on things like axes and jackknives and all that kind of stuff. And I really like my jackknives. And watching Roger, oh my God. So I went into Mike's, and there was a whole big cardboard thing of Camp King jackknives. Well, okay, they were cheap junk, but what the hell? He had the same price from 1957, so I bought the whole damn thing and gave it to Roger. I said, here, destroy them at your leisure.
It's really, I'm really glad that I came today, because all these stories just bring so many memories to me. Thanks, Dick, for telling me to come. I have to just thank the community for just a fabulous childhood. My father was a doctor here. My grandfather was a doctor here, and he owned the big, it's now the, it was a nursing home, and now it's owned by the college on the corner of Waybridge and, what's it called?
Kitchell House.
Kitchell House. Yeah, and yeah, I'm so grateful that I can tell my friends I had the best childhood in the world. I walked to school, in elementary school. I walked to the Twilight House to school, and then when Mary Hogan opened up, because there were so many kids, it was the big explosion of the population explosion. So then I walked to Mary Hogan. And one of the memorable things that happened in Mary Hogan was on Halloween, we had a parade, and we had the band, and we all had our costumes, and we walked behind the band. And I walked as a nurse in a nurse uniform, and I decided that I was going to be a nurse, and I was going to work overseas, and I did. But it was real significant. Then in high school, we walked to school, and we'd go across the trestle on the railroad. And my parents never knew any of this, we just did it. And coming home, we had so much fun stopping at Lockwood's, having French fries, stopping at, I think it's Ruby's that had the penny candy. I can't remember. My prom dresses come from Gray's. And Dick Thodall would walk me home and help me with my books. Thank you, Dick. I remember that. And the other thing that was just great is we had great teachers at MUHS. And Alice, thank you. You were a fabulous teacher. I think I did write you a letter when I was in college thanking you for helping me write really clearly and simply. And I always did well in my papers, and I credit you. Thank you. That was great. Also, growing up, I was a part of the Congregational Church. My father was the bone doctor, so he had to be up at the Snow Bowl every weekend. And so as kids, we grew up at the Snow Bowl. And the Congregational Church was really great because they made a special service in the morning, so we could wear our pants, our ski pants that were stretchy, and they went underneath the boots. We all got out of church, and we all ran up to the Snow Bowl, and that was a very special, special time. I remember the movies that you've all talked about. I remember the film melting and yelling out, "Adar!" I don't know why we said Adar. We going, "Adar!" So anyways, and they were 25 cents for the film. I did go to the movie theater, that's the Town Hall Theater, with my dad. And it was Old Yeller, and it was such a sad movie. And my father had to leave me because he had to deliver a baby right in the middle of the film. I'll never forget that. Then I think the thing that kind of strikes me as a kid is that our parents just let us walk, ride our bikes everywhere. They didn't know where we were. They just had to come home for lunch and for dinner, and that was all. There was no smartphones, cell phones. we were just free to be, and that was such a wonderful thing. So I just want to thank everybody and for allowing me to have such a great childhood here. Thanks.
Well, we could go on for the next hour and a half, 3 hours, right? So we hope you will do that informally among yourselves and stay for the next story cycle, different storytellers and some of the same, starting at 6 o'clock. I want to point out the images that are all around the perimeter of the room. Dorothy Langevin has spent hours collecting these, especially from the Ilsley and from Sheldon Museum. And so take a look at them. If you have any questions, ask Dorothea. Do you want to, I'm not sure, talk to Dorothea. She would like you to write some things down when you see images and maybe identify some of the people. So I want to thank 3 groups of people. I want to thank our hosts for kind of keeping things moving along and doing such a great job. And I want to thank the storytellers. You were fabulous. We had no idea the richness of the stories that we got to hear today. So thank you. And finally, I want to thank all of you for coming and being part of this unique adventure. I also want to, is David Hohenschow here? David is he's not here, okay. He's the person that has received the grant that is going to enable poetry to be embedded in the sidewalks next year in downtown Middlebury, which is going to be a very special kind of opportunity for us. And I was hoping he'd be here so you could talk with him, but he's not.
I can speak to it a little bit. Dave's a friend of mine, and he, at some point in this process, he's going to elicit poems from the community to be placed in meaningful spots. So it will be a community-based process. So I'm sure you'll hear about it.
So maybe some of you who didn't get to tell a story, or maybe some of you storytellers, will condense your story into a poem.
Because there's only going to be 5 sidewalk poems in the first round, I've talked to the library about possibly having an exhibition about the same time that the sidewalk opens up of a lot of the other submissions. So we'll have an exhibition of other things people have written in Ilsley.
Great, because poetry rules. So thank you for coming. Enjoy the display, and maybe see you at 6.